Hey there! Today, we're going to take a look at what life was really like in medieval Europe. Sure, you've heard all about kings, knights, and castles, but what about the everyday people? In this video, we'll talk about how peasants lived and worked in feudal France, what the markets were like for merchants and traders, and how scholars shaped the early universities of France and Italy. We'll explore the countryside of Scotland and Ireland, where monks lived in peaceful monasteries, and the court life in Spain, full of chivalry and romance. Plus, we'll see how guilds influenced artisans in the Low Countries, and the power the church held over daily life in places like Italy. So, sit back and relax as we journey through medieval Europe. There's a lot to discover, and I promise it's more fascinating than you might think. Feudal life in France: lords, vassals, and serfs. In medieval France, the feudal system was the foundation of social, economic, and political life. This complex hierarchy was based on land ownership, which determined power, wealth, and status. At the top of the pyramid were the kings and nobles, who controlled vast estates, and at the bottom were the serfs, the peasantry that worked the land. The relationships between lords, vassals, and serfs were governed by mutual obligations, creating a rigid system that structured everyday life for centuries. At the heart of the feudal system was the lord, a nobleman who held large tracts of land, known as fiefs, granted to him by the king in return for military service and loyalty. These lords had a duty to provide troops for the king during times of war, and in return, they were allowed to govern their lands as they saw fit, often exercising nearly absolute control over those who lived on their estates. However, the lords didn't work the land themselves. Instead, they relied on a complex network of vassals and serfs to maintain and cultivate their estates. Vassals were typically lesser nobles or knights who pledged their loyalty to the lord in exchange for a portion of land. This arrangement was sealed by a ceremony where the vassal swore an oath of fealty to the lord, promising to serve him in both times of war and peace. In return, the vassal was given land to govern, which he would manage and protect. Vassals often had their own vassals beneath them, creating a cascading structure of responsibility and loyalty that bound everyone from the lowliest knight to the highest noble to the king. The vassal's primary responsibility was military service. When the lord called upon them, vassals were expected to gather their own small armies and go to war on the lord's behalf. They also had to manage the land given to them, ensuring that it was productive and profitable. Vassals often administered justice on their lands, acting as judges in disputes between the peasants and overseeing the collection of taxes and rents. Their lives were filled with duties that required balancing loyalty to their lord with their own ambitions for power and wealth. At the bottom of the feudal hierarchy were the serfs, who were neither slaves nor free men. Serfs were peasants tied to the land, meaning they couldn't leave the estate without the lord's permission. In return for working the lord's fields, tending animals, and maintaining the estate, serfs were allowed to live on the land and receive protection from their lord in times of war. They were also granted small plots of land to farm for their own sustenance, though the majority of their produce went to the lord as rent. Life for serfs was incredibly difficult. Their days began before dawn, and their work was physically exhausting. They plowed fields, sowed crops, and harvested grain, often working from sunrise to sunset. In return, they lived in simple, often poorly constructed homes made of wood, stone, and thatch. These homes typically consisted of a single room, shared by the entire family, and even sometimes by the livestock during the cold winter months. The diet of a serf was basic: bread, porridge, and occasionally vegetables. Meat was a luxury few serfs could afford. Despite their harsh lives, serfs were an integral part of medieval society. The success of the feudal system relied on their labor, and without the serfs, the entire economic structure would have collapsed. Serfs were bound by duty, not just to their lords but also to the church, which played a dominant role in their daily lives. The church taught that suffering in this life would be rewarded in the afterlife, and many serfs took comfort in their faith. Sunday was a day of rest and worship, and religious festivals provided some respite from the hard work of agricultural life. The manor was the center of life in feudal France, both socially and economically. A typical manor consisted of the lord's residence, often a fortified castle or manor house, surrounded by the homes of the peasants. The lord's manor was the seat of power, and the surrounding lands, including forests, fields, and pastures, were worked by the serfs. While the lord lived in relative comfort, hosting feasts, and holding court, the peasants lived under strict regulations. They needed the lord's permission to marry, leave the estate, or engage in trade outside the manor. The church also wielded immense power in medieval France, influencing nearly every aspect of life. In addition to their daily prayers and religious observances, serfs and lords alike paid tithes to the church, a tenth of their income or produce. Priests were often the most educated members of the community and played a central role in both religious and secular matters. Churches were not only places of worship but also served as gathering points for social events, festivals, and markets. The church's influence extended into the legal system, where canon law governed moral conduct and resolved disputes. Life for the nobles and lords, though far more comfortable than that of the peasants, was not without its challenges. Lords were expected to protect their estates and their people, often through military service. The constant threat of war meant that lords had to maintain a standing force of knights and men-at-arms, ready to defend the manor at a moment's notice. Feasts and court life were important social events, allowing lords to display their wealth and power, form alliances, and negotiate marriages or political agreements. The relationship between lords and their vassals, as well as between lords and serfs, was one of mutual dependence, though far from equal. While the serfs relied on the lord's protection, the lords depended on the serfs for their labor, and the vassals for military support. This web of obligations and duties bound everyone into a system that, while rigid, created stability in a time of uncertainty and conflict. Feudal life in medieval France was deeply hierarchical, with each person knowing their place in society. The roles of lords, vassals, and serfs created a structured way of life that, while unequal, ensured that the land was cultivated, the people were protected, and the king's authority was maintained across the kingdom. The role of the church in medieval Italy. In medieval Italy, the Catholic Church was the most powerful and influential institution, shaping every aspect of life, from politics to education, and from art to everyday routines. Unlike in other regions of Europe, where kings and emperors wielded central power, Italy was fragmented into city-states and principalities, and the Church played a crucial role in unifying these regions under a common religious and cultural identity. For both the noble elite and ordinary citizens, the Church was a dominant force, influencing not only spiritual life but also social structures, political alliances, and economic development. At the heart of this religious power was the Pope, the supreme leader of the Catholic Church, who resided in Rome. The papacy, though a religious institution, wielded immense political influence, not just in Italy but across all of Europe. Italian city-states like Florence, Venice, and Milan often sought the support of the Pope in their conflicts, knowing that the papal endorsement could tilt the balance of power in their favor. In return, these cities were expected to show loyalty to the Church, contributing funds and military support when needed. The Church's power was not limited to political maneuvering at the highest levels. For the everyday citizen, religion was central to daily life. The parish church was the focal point of community life, offering not only a place for worship but also a gathering space for social and civic activities. Every significant moment in life, from birth through marriage to death, was marked by religious rites. The church offered solace in times of hardship, but it also demanded obedience. Mass was attended every Sunday, and religious festivals, celebrated throughout the year, punctuated the lives of both the rural and urban populations. One of the church's most important roles in medieval Italy was its influence over education. Monasteries and convents were centers of learning, preserving ancient texts and promoting the study of theology, philosophy, and the sciences. Monks and nuns were often among the most educated individuals, and their role extended beyond religious duties. They acted as scribes, teachers, and healers, providing critical services to their communities. Many young men from noble families were sent to monasteries for their education, and this training often paved the way for them to take up important roles in both the church and secular government. The monastic orders, such as the Benedictines, Franciscans, and Dominicans, were particularly influential in Italy. These orders were dedicated to living a life of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but they also played an essential role in shaping the culture and society of medieval Italy. The Franciscans, for example, founded by Saint Francis of Assisi, promoted a life of humility and service to the poor. Their message resonated deeply with the urban poor and the lower classes, bringing the church's influence into even the most marginalized corners of society. The church's influence extended into the realm of art and architecture as well. Many of the most iconic buildings of medieval Italy, such as St. Peter's Basilica in Rome and the Cathedral of Florence, were commissioned by the church. The church was the primary patron of the arts, funding the creation of religious paintings, sculptures, and manuscripts that reflected the values and teachings of Catholicism. Religious art wasn't just about beautifying churches, it was a powerful tool for teaching the largely illiterate population the stories of the Bible and the lives of saints. Through vibrant frescoes, mosaics, and stained glass, the church communicated complex theological concepts to ordinary people in a visually accessible way. Despite its immense power, the church in medieval Italy was not without controversy. Corruption within the clergy, the wealth accumulated by high-ranking church officials, and the practice of selling indulgences, payments made to reduce the time a soul spent in purgatory, drew criticism from various quarters. Reform movements occasionally emerged, seeking to purify the church and restore its focus on spirituality rather than wealth and political power. One of the most famous reformers was Girolamo Savonarola, a Dominican friar who preached against the moral corruption of the church and the lavish lifestyles of the Italian elite. His fiery sermons in Florence sparked a brief but intense movement for religious and political reform, although it ultimately ended in his execution. The church's legal system, known as canon law, also played a significant role in shaping Italian society. Church courts handled a wide range of legal matters, from marriage and inheritance disputes to cases of heresy. These courts operated independently of secular authorities, giving the church significant influence over the everyday lives of people. In many cases, religious law could override the laws of the city-states, and individuals could be excommunicated, effectively cut off from society, if they defied church rulings. Religious life in Italy was also marked by deep devotion to saints and the veneration of religious relics. Each city and region had its own patron saints, believed to protect the city and its people. The feast days of these saints were celebrated with grand festivals, processions, and religious ceremonies. Pilgrimages to the sites of saints' relics or to holy places like Rome or Assisi were a common practice, drawing both the faithful and the curious from across Italy and beyond. These pilgrimages were not only spiritual journeys but also important social events, bringing together people from all walks of life. In sum, the Church's influence in medieval Italy was all-encompassing. It shaped the political landscape, controlled education, inspired art and culture, and governed the spiritual lives of the people. From the grand cathedrals and monastic orders to the humble parish church, the Catholic Church was the cornerstone of medieval Italian life. Its power and reach touched every individual, from the wealthiest noble to the poorest peasant, and its legacy continues to be felt in the cultural and architectural heritage of Italy today. Medieval England, life in the villages and towns. In medieval England, the majority of the population lived in small villages, while only a minority resided in towns. The divide between rural and urban life was stark, with the rhythms of daily existence shaped by the land, the seasons, and the church. The feudal system, much like in France, structured society, determining the roles of peasants, artisans, and the nobility. For most, life was difficult, but communities were close-knit, and the traditions and customs that developed in villages and towns laid the groundwork for modern English society. Village life in medieval England revolved around agriculture. The village was typically made up of small houses or cottages clustered around a manor house, which was the home of the local lord or his steward. Surrounding the village were fields that the peasants farmed collectively. This system, known as the open field system, divided the land into strips, and each family was assigned certain strips to farm. The peasants worked the land for the lord, and in return, they were granted protection and the right to cultivate their own small plots for food. At the heart of every village was the church, a central gathering point for worship and community events. Religion played a huge role in the lives of medieval villagers, shaping not only their spiritual beliefs but also their calendar. The year was punctuated by religious festivals, saints' days, and feasts, which provided brief respites from the hard work of farming. The church was also where major life events, baptisms, marriages, and funerals were marked. Priests, often the most educated members of the village, were respected figures who also acted as teachers and scribes. Daily life for peasants in the village was dominated by work. Men typically labored in the fields, plowing, sowing, and harvesting crops, while women took care of the household, raised children, and worked in the gardens. In addition to their agricultural duties, villagers were often required to perform labor services for the lord, such as repairing roads, maintaining the manor, or working in the lord's fields. Life was physically demanding, and food could be scarce, particularly during harsh winters or when crops failed. Peasant homes were simple, usually consisting of 1 or 2 rooms with dirt floors, thatched roofs, and little in the way of furniture. While most of the population lived in villages, towns in medieval England were centers of trade, craftsmanship, and growing urbanization. Townsfolk had a different lifestyle compared to peasants, and the social structures of towns were more fluid, with merchants, craftsmen, and tradespeople playing key roles. Towns were often located along rivers or major roads, making them important hubs for trade and commerce. Guilds played a central role in the social and economic life of medieval towns. These were associations of artisans and merchants who controlled the practice of their trades. Guilds regulated everything from quality standards to prices, and they protected the interests of their members. Joining a guild was a mark of prestige, and guild members often held positions of influence within the town. Apprentices, young men training in a craft, were taken in by master craftsmen and taught their trade, eventually becoming journeymen and, if successful, masters in their own right. Towns were also notable for their marketplaces, where local and foreign goods were bought and sold. The weekly market was a major event, attracting not only townsfolk but also peasants from the surrounding villages who came to sell their produce or buy items they couldn't make themselves. Towns like London, York, and Winchester became centers of wealth and power, where trade routes brought in luxury goods from across Europe and even beyond. Despite the growing importance of towns, life there wasn't necessarily easier than in the villages. Towns were often overcrowded, and poor sanitation led to the spread of diseases. The streets were narrow, lined with wooden houses, and waste was commonly thrown out of windows into the streets below. Epidemics, such as the Black Death in 1348, could wipe out significant portions of the population in a short period of time. The plague devastated both towns and villages, leaving deep scars on medieval English society. While the towns offered more opportunities for wealth and social mobility, they were also centers of social tension. As towns grew wealthier, the gap between the rich merchants and the poor workers widened. The growing middle class of merchants and tradesmen began to challenge the traditional power structures dominated by the aristocracy, paving the way for significant social changes in later centuries. In both villages and towns, the church remained a powerful force. Cathedrals in cities like Canterbury and Durham were not only places of worship but also important centers of power and wealth. The monasteries, with their libraries and scriptoria, preserved much of the learning of the ancient world and were places where knowledge was passed down. The church dictated much of the rhythm of daily life, whether in the bustling towns or the quiet countryside. In summary, medieval England's social life was deeply shaped by the land, the church, and the feudal system. Whether living in a rural village or a bustling town, people's lives were structured around work, religion, and community. For most, life was hard, but the bonds of family and community helped them navigate the challenges of medieval existence. The Hanseatic League, trade and society in Northern Europe. In the medieval period, the Hanseatic League played a crucial role in shaping trade and society across Northern Europe. This powerful alliance of merchant guilds and cities dominated commerce in the Baltic and North Sea regions from the 13th to the 15th century, becoming a key player in the economic and political landscape of the Middle Ages. The League wasn't just about trade, it also influenced the culture, governance, and social life of the cities it connected. The Hanseatic League was not a country or an empire, but rather a network of cities that banded together to protect their commercial interests. At its height, the League included over 200 cities, including major centers such as Lübeck, Hamburg, Bremen, Riga, and Cologne. These cities, located in modern-day Germany, the Netherlands, Poland, and the Baltic states, became bustling hubs of trade, exchanging goods like timber, grain, fish, furs, and textiles across the region. The League's success was rooted in its ability to maintain monopolies over key trade routes and goods. Hanseatic merchants were known for their exceptional organization, forming guilds that protected their rights and maintained high standards of quality. These merchants dominated maritime trade, controlling the shipping lanes that connected Northern Europe with the rest of the continent. Hanseatic ships, known as cogs, were a common sight in ports from London to Novgorod. The economic prosperity brought by the Hanseatic League had a profound impact on the social life of the cities it touched. The wealth generated from trade led to the growth of urban centers, and cities like Lübeck and Hamburg flourished as commercial hubs. The rise of the merchant class also shifted the traditional social hierarchy, giving rise to a powerful bourgeoisie that challenged the dominance of the feudal lords and the church. Merchants, not nobles, began to hold significant political power in these cities, with many becoming members of city councils and exerting influence over local governance. This shift in power was evident in the guild system that dominated Hanseatic cities. Merchant guilds were the backbone of the League, controlling trade practices, resolving disputes, and ensuring that their members were protected from unfair competition. These guilds also had a social function, organizing festivals, providing support for members in times of hardship, and playing a key role in the cultural life of the city. The Guildhall, often the largest and most impressive building in the city, was not only a place of business but also a center for social gatherings, banquets, and celebrations. Hanseatic society was diverse, with merchants, artisans, shipbuilders, and laborers all contributing to the economy of the cities. However, social mobility was limited. While the wealthier merchants enjoyed a privileged status, the working class had fewer opportunities to rise above their station. The gap between the wealthy and the poor was significant, and while the cities were prosperous, poverty and inequality were still prevalent in many areas. Religion also played an important role in Hanseatic life, but the League maintained a complex relationship with the Catholic Church. The merchants were pragmatic, seeking to maintain good relations with the Church, but they were also fiercely independent, often resisting attempts by the Church to interfere in their affairs. Many Hanseatic cities built grand churches and cathedrals, demonstrating their wealth and piety, but the League itself operated with a certain degree of autonomy from both the Church and the nobility. Culturally, the Hanseatic League left a lasting legacy in Northern Europe. The cities of the League were known for their distinctive brick Gothic architecture, with grand merchant houses, churches, and city halls built in this style. Art, music, and literature flourished in these cities, often influenced by the trading connections that brought new ideas and goods from across Europe. The Hanseatic cultural network extended beyond economic trade, with cities sharing artistic and architectural trends, fostering a sense of common identity among the League's members. One of the League's most significant contributions was the creation of a common legal framework that helped regulate trade across borders. The League's members agree on standards for weights, measures, and prices, making it easier to do business across different regions. This common legal system not only facilitated trade but also helped resolve disputes between merchants from different cities. The League's courts were renowned for their fairness, and merchants from outside the League often sought its protection and legal support. However, the League's dominance began to wane in the late 15th century as new trade routes opened up, and the rise of powerful nation-states such as England and the Netherlands challenged its monopoly. Additionally, internal conflicts between member cities and the growing influence of territorial rulers weakened the League's unity. By the end of the 16th century, the Hanseatic League had largely lost its power, but its legacy lived on in the cities it had shaped and the trade networks it had established. In summary, the Hanseatic League was more than just an economic powerhouse. It was a social and cultural force that transformed the cities of Northern Europe. Through trade, the League brought wealth, power, and cultural exchange to the region, and its influence can still be seen in the architecture, governance, and culture of the cities it touched. Germanic tribes and social structures in the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire, which spanned much of Central Europe, was a complex political entity that brought together various Germanic tribes under a loose, decentralized system of governance. Formed in the early medieval period, the empire was a successor to the Roman Empire in the West and was centered around modern-day Germany, Austria, and parts of Italy. The Germanic tribes that formed the backbone of the empire had their own distinct social structures, customs, and traditions, which blended over time to create a unique medieval society. At the core of the Holy Roman Empire's social hierarchy were the nobles, a class that included dukes, counts, and princes. These nobles controlled vast lands and had considerable autonomy, often functioning like independent rulers within their own territories. They were responsible for governing their lands, administering justice, and raising troops for the emperor when needed. In return, They swore allegiance to the Holy Roman Emperor, though in practice, the emperor's power was often limited by the strength and influence of these regional lords. The nobility in the Holy Roman Empire often traced their lineage back to the Germanic warrior tribes that had once dominated the region. Tribes like the Franks, Saxons, Bavarians, and Swabians had long histories of warfare and conquest, and their leaders maintained a strong sense of tribal identity and loyalty to their kin. Over time, these tribal distinctions blurred as the empire grew, but the influence of Germanic tribal culture remained evident in the empire's feudal structures, military traditions, and social customs. Feudalism was the dominant system of governance and social organization in the Holy Roman Empire. The emperor granted land, or fiefs, to the nobles in exchange for military service and loyalty. These nobles, in turn, granted portions of their land to vassals, who were often knights or lower-ranking nobles. The vassals managed the land and ensured its productivity while also fulfilling military obligations to their lords. This chain of loyalty extended from the emperor down to the lowest levels of society, binding everyone in a web of mutual obligations. Knights played a crucial role in the social structure of the empire. As heavily armed and mounted warriors, they were the backbone of the feudal military system. In exchange for their service, knights were granted land and the privileges of nobility, though their wealth and status varied widely. Some knights were powerful landowners in their own right, while others were little more than glorified soldiers, dependent on the support of their lords. The knightly class adhered to a strict code of chivalry, which emphasized loyalty, bravery, and honor, though these ideals were not always followed in practice. Below the knights and vassals were the peasants, who made up the vast majority of the population. Peasant life in the Holy Roman Empire was shaped by the demands of agriculture and the feudal system. Peasants were typically serfs, meaning they were bound to the land and could not leave without their lord's permission. In exchange for farming the land and providing labor, peasants received protection and the right to work small plots for their own subsistence. Peasant life was harsh, with long hours of hard labor and little in the way of comforts. However, villages were tight-knit communities, and festivals, religious observances, and occasional market days provided some respite from the daily grind. Religion played a central role in the social life of the Holy Roman Empire. The Catholic Church was deeply intertwined with the political structures of the empire, and bishops, abbots, and other high-ranking church officials wielded significant power. Many members of the nobility held both secular and ecclesiastical titles, blurring the line between religious and political authority. The church was also a major landowner in the empire, and its influence extended into nearly every aspect of life, from education to law. Monasteries and abbeys were key centers of learning and cultural preservation during the medieval period. Monks and nuns in the Holy Roman Empire copied ancient texts, composed music, and produced illuminated manuscripts, keeping alive the intellectual traditions of antiquity. These religious institutions also played a vital economic role, managing large estates and providing employment to local peasants. The influence of the Church was further reinforced by the Holy Roman Emperor's claim to be the protector of Christendom, a title that added a religious dimension to the empire's political authority. The Germanic tribal legacy of the Holy Roman Empire was also reflected in its legal traditions. Germanic law, which was based on tribal customs, existed alongside Roman law, creating a unique legal system that governed everything from inheritance disputes to criminal cases. Local courts, often presided over by nobles or bishops, were responsible for administering justice, and trial by combat or ordeal was not uncommon in the early medieval period. Over time, the influence of Roman law grew, particularly in the cities, but the Germanic emphasis on personal loyalty and kinship ties remained a powerful force in society. The cities of the Holy Roman Empire, though smaller and less powerful than those in Italy or the Low Countries, were important centers of trade and craftsmanship. Cities like Cologne, Nuremberg, and Augsburg were hubs of commerce, where merchants and artisans prospered under the protection of city charters granted by the emperor. Guilds, similar to those in other parts of Europe, regulated trade and craft production, ensuring high standards of quality and protecting the interests of their members. These cities were also centers of cultural life, with vibrant markets, churches, and schools. By the late Middle Ages, the Holy Roman Empire had become a patchwork of semi-independent states, each with its own customs, laws, and rulers. While the Germanic tribes that had once formed the backbone of the empire had largely assimilated into a more centralized feudal system, their legacy lived on in the values of loyalty, military service, and regional identity that shaped life in the empire. Nobles and knights, the aristocracy in Spain. In medieval Spain, the nobility and knights played a crucial role in shaping both the political and social landscape. During this period, Spain was not a unified kingdom but a collection of Christian and Muslim states, including the Kingdom of Castile, Aragon, Navarre, and the Emirate of Granada. The aristocracy in Spain was highly influential, not just in governance and warfare, but also in maintaining a rigid social hierarchy that dominated the country's feudal society. The nobles of Spain, or the grandees, were the highest-ranking members of the aristocracy, holding vast estates and commanding powerful armies. These noble families, many of whom claimed ancient lineages, were loyal to the king in name but often operated independently, exercising significant control over their lands and people. Nobles were expected to maintain order, administer justice, and protect their domains from external threats, particularly during the Reconquista, the long and complex campaign by Christian states to recapture territory from the Muslim rulers of Spain. The aristocracy in Spain was deeply intertwined with the military elite, as nobles were also warriors. Knighthood was a central aspect of noble identity. From a young age, noble boys were trained to become knights, learning the arts of war, horsemanship, and chivalry. By the age of 21, they could be officially knighted through a ceremony that involved a symbolic dubbing, often conducted by the king or high-ranking noble. Knighthood was both a mark of prestige and a responsibility, as knights were expected to fight in defense of their lands and their faith. Spain's unique position at the crossroads of Christian and Muslim civilizations meant that the role of knights and nobles was closely tied to religious warfare. The Reconquista was not just a territorial conflict but also a religious one, with knights fighting under the banner of Christianity to reclaim lands from Muslim rulers. Many of the greatest Spanish nobles, such as El Cid, Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, gained fame through their exploits in battle against Muslim forces. These military campaigns not only expanded Christian territory but also cemented the power and prestige of the Spanish aristocracy. The code of chivalry, which dictated the behavior of knights, was central to the identity of Spanish nobles. Chivalric values, such as loyalty, bravery, and honor, were not just ideals but expected norms of behavior. Knights were also bound by a deep sense of religious duty, seeing themselves as the defenders of the Christian faith. This was particularly true in Spain, where the constant threat of conflict with Muslim neighbors reinforced the belief that knights had a divine mission to fight for their religion. However, chivalry was also about courtly love and social obligations. Nobles were expected to participate in court life, hosting feasts, attending tournaments, and maintaining the decorum of high society. Tournaments and jousting were not only forms of entertainment but also opportunities for knights to demonstrate their skills in battle and gain recognition. Success in tournaments could enhance a knight's reputation and standing within noble circles. These events often drew large crowds and were accompanied by grand feasts and celebrations, showcasing the wealth and power of the aristocracy. The role of women in the Spanish aristocracy was complex. Noble women were often expected to manage estates while their husbands were away at war. They were responsible for overseeing household affairs, ensuring that the land was productive, and managing the labor of serfs and tenants. In some cases, noble women also played a role in diplomacy, arranging marriages or negotiating political alliances. Although their public power was limited, women of the aristocracy exercised significant influence behind the scenes, particularly in family matters and the management of estates. Religion played a significant role in the life of the Spanish nobility. The Catholic Church was not only a spiritual authority but also a political and social one. Nobles were expected to fund the construction of churches and monasteries, participate in religious festivals, and donate land or wealth to religious institutions. The church also provided education to the children of nobles, who often sent their sons to monasteries or cathedrals to be educated by monks and priests. The aristocracy's wealth was largely based on land ownership. Nobles held vast estates, worked by peasants or serfs who were bound to the land. In return for their labor, serfs were offered protection and a place to live, but their lives were difficult, with heavy taxes and little opportunity for advancement. Noble estates were often self-sufficient, producing enough food and goods to sustain the local population. However, nobles also engaged in trade, exporting wool, wine, and other products to neighboring regions and beyond. The Spanish nobility was also instrumental in fostering cultural exchange between Christian and Muslim communities. Despite the conflicts of the Reconquista, there were periods of peaceful coexistence, particularly in regions like Toledo and Seville, where Christian and Muslim scholars, artists, and architects worked together. The influence of Islamic art, architecture, and learning can still be seen in Spain's Moorish architecture, with its intricate tilework, arches, and courtyards, blending with the Gothic style of Christian churches and cathedrals. By the late Middle Ages, the aristocracy in Spain began to consolidate its power, and many noble families became involved in the unification of the Spanish kingdoms. The marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile in 1469 marked the beginning of a new era, as these two powerful monarchs worked to unify Spain and complete the Reconquista. The nobles, once fiercely independent, gradually became integrated into the larger Spanish state, serving as loyal vassals to the crown and contributing to Spain's rise as a global power. Peasant life in the Kingdom of Hungary. In medieval Hungary, the vast majority of the population consisted of peasants who lived under a feudal system similar to that found across much of Europe. The Kingdom of Hungary, established in the year 1000 by King Stephen I, was a powerful and influential realm in Central Europe. While the nobility enjoyed considerable wealth and privilege, the peasants who worked the land formed the backbone of the economy, providing the agricultural labor necessary to sustain the kingdom. The typical medieval Hungarian village was small, consisting of modest homes made of wood or clay, with thatched roofs. These villages were often located near rivers or fertile plains, which provided the water and land needed for farming. The peasants, known as serfs, were tied to the land and were expected to work in the service of the local nobles or landowners. In exchange for their labor, peasants were granted a small plot of land to farm for their own subsistence, though a significant portion of their harvest was required to be given to the lord as taxes or rent. Agriculture in Hungary was focused primarily on grain production, particularly wheat and barley, though peasants also grew vegetables and raised livestock such as pigs, sheep, and cattle. The work was labor-intensive and followed the natural rhythms of the seasons. Spring and summer were the busiest times of the year, with planting, weeding, and harvesting occupying much of the peasants' time. Winter provided a brief respite from fieldwork, though peasants still had to tend to their animals, make repairs to their homes, and prepare for the next growing season. Life for peasants in medieval Hungary was harsh. Working conditions were grueling, and the majority of peasants lived in poverty with limited access to resources or upward mobility. Their homes were small and poorly insulated, with dirt floors and simple furniture. Meals were basic, typically consisting of bread, porridge, and vegetables, with meat being a rare luxury. Despite the hardships, village life provided a strong sense of community. Peasants relied on one another for support, sharing tools, knowledge, and labor. The village church was often the center of social life, with religious festivals and celebrations providing moments of relief from the hard work of farming. The church played a significant role in the lives of Hungarian peasants, as it did across Europe. Peasants were expected to attend Mass regularly and pay tithes, a form of tax given to the church. Religious holidays and festivals were important events in the peasants' calendar, offering a chance to celebrate, feast, and socialize with their neighbors. The church also offered solace and hope, teaching that suffering in this life would be rewarded in the afterlife. Hungarian peasants were subject to the authority of local nobles or landowners, who exercised significant control over their lives. The relationship between the peasants and the nobles was one of mutual obligation, though it was heavily skewed in favor of the nobles. In return for their labor, peasants received protection from the noble and the right to farm their own small plots of land. However, they had little say in how the land was managed, and they were often subject to high taxes and harsh penalties for failing to meet their obligations. Nobles could demand labor services from peasants, requiring them to work on the lord's land, repair roads, or perform other tasks as needed. In addition to their agricultural duties, some peasants also worked as craftsmen, producing goods such as pottery, textiles, or tools that were used within the village or traded at local markets. However, most peasants had limited access to trade, as they were often bound to the land and could not leave without the lord's permission. In larger villages or towns, market days provided an opportunity for peasants to sell their surplus produce and buy goods that they could not make themselves. These markets were also important social gatherings, where news was exchanged and community bonds were strengthened. While most of the peasantry lived in relative isolation within their villages, the larger towns and cities of Hungary offered a different way of life. In towns like Buda and Pest, the growing merchant class created a vibrant urban culture. Some peasants, particularly those with specialized skills or those who had saved enough money, could occasionally move to towns and start a new life as artisans or traders. However, such opportunities were rare, and the vast majority of peasants spent their entire lives working the land. By the later medieval period, the relationship between the peasants and the nobility began to change, particularly following significant events such as invasions by the Mongols in the 13th century and the Ottoman Turks in the 14th and 15th centuries. These invasions caused widespread destruction and disrupted agricultural production, leading to increased taxes and hardship for the peasantry. In response to these pressures, some peasants began to resist the demands of the nobles, leading to occasional uprisings and conflicts. However, most of these rebellions were quickly suppressed, and the feudal system remained firmly in place. Despite the challenges they faced, Hungarian peasants were resilient, adapting to the changing political and economic landscape of the medieval period. Their labor sustained the kingdom, providing the food and resources needed to support both the nobility and the growing urban centers. Although their lives were hard, the bonds of family, faith, and community helped them endure the hardships of medieval life. In conclusion, the peasants of the Kingdom of Hungary lived difficult yet vital lives. Bound to the land and subject to the authority of the nobility, they worked tirelessly to produce the food and goods that sustained the kingdom. While their opportunities for social mobility were limited, they played an essential role in the development of Hungary's economy and society during the medieval period. Byzantine social life, the influence of East Rome. The Byzantine Empire, also known as East Rome, was one of the most influential and long-lasting civilizations in medieval history. While it was the political and cultural continuation of the Roman Empire in the East, Byzantine society developed its own unique social structure and way of life. For over 1,000 years, from the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century to the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the Byzantine Empire shaped the cultural, political, and religious landscape of Europe and the Mediterranean. At the heart of Byzantine social life was the city of Constantinople, the empire's capital, which was often referred to as the New Rome. Constantinople was not only the political center of the empire but also a hub of trade, culture, and religion. Its strategic location on the crossroads between Europe and Asia made it one of the most important cities in the medieval world. The city's wealth and sophistication were unmatched, and it was renowned for its impressive architecture, such as the Hagia Sophia, which symbolized the grandeur of Byzantine civilization. Byzantine society was structured around a rigid hierarchical system that divided people into distinct social classes. At the top of this hierarchy was the emperor, who was considered God's representative on earth. The emperor wielded immense power, ruling both the state and the church. Beneath the emperor was the aristocracy, a class of wealthy landowners and high-ranking officials who controlled much of the empire's wealth. This elite class held positions of power in the government and the military, and their influence extended into nearly every aspect of Byzantine life. The middle class in Byzantine society consisted of merchants, artisans, and professionals, many of whom lived in Constantinople or other major cities such as Thessalonica or Antioch. The empire's strategic location and its control over key trade routes allowed the middle class to prosper, particularly through the trade of silk, spices, and luxury goods that flowed into the city from Asia, Africa, and Europe. Artisans were highly respected in Byzantine society, especially those who worked in the icon and mosaic industries, producing religious art that decorated churches and public spaces throughout the empire. While the middle class thrived in the cities, the majority of the Byzantine population lived in rural areas and worked the land. Peasants were the backbone of Byzantine society, responsible for producing the food that sustained the empire. Most peasants were tenant farmers, meaning they worked the land that belonged to wealthy landowners in exchange for a portion of their crops. Some peasants owned their own small plots of land, while others were serfs tied to the estates of the aristocracy. Rural life in the Byzantine Empire was difficult, with long hours of labor in the fields, but the rural population was essential to the empire's survival. Religion played a central role in Byzantine social life. The Eastern Orthodox Church was a defining feature of Byzantine identity, and its influence permeated every level of society. The Church was not only a spiritual authority but also a major political force, with the Patriarch of Constantinople acting as the religious leader of the empire. The Church maintained close ties to the state, and the emperor often took an active role in religious affairs, including the appointment of church officials and the organization of religious councils. Religious festivals and celebrations were an integral part of Byzantine social life. The feast days of saints, the Easter celebrations, and the Emperor's Day were major events in the Byzantine calendar, marked by public processions, feasts, and religious ceremonies. These events provided an opportunity for the emperor and the aristocracy to demonstrate their wealth and power, while also reinforcing the religious and cultural unity of the empire. Icons, religious images of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints, were central to Byzantine worship, and their veneration was a key part of daily life. Education was highly valued in Byzantine society, particularly for the elite. The Byzantine educational system was based on the classical Greek and Roman traditions, with a strong emphasis on rhetoric, philosophy, and theology. Boys from wealthy families were often sent to study with private tutors or attend prestigious schools in Constantinople, where they were trained in the arts of governance, diplomacy, and warfare. Many of the empire's most famous scholars, such as Michael Psellos and Anna Komnene, were products of this rigorous educational system. Byzantine women had a more restricted role in society compared to men, though their influence was still significant, especially within the aristocracy. Women of the upper classes were often involved in managing household estates, overseeing servants, and making key family decisions. Some women, particularly those of imperial or noble lineage, wielded considerable political power. Empress Theodora, for example, was a powerful and influential figure who co-ruled with her husband, Emperor Justinian I, and played a central role in shaping Byzantine policy. Byzantine social life was also heavily influenced by its connections to other cultures. The empire's location at the crossroads of Europe and Asia meant that it was a melting pot of cultures, with influences from Greek, Roman, Persian, and Arab civilizations. This cultural diversity was reflected in Byzantine art, architecture, and literature, which blended classical traditions with Eastern influences to create a distinctive Byzantine style. Despite its wealth and sophistication, Byzantine society was not without its challenges. The empire faced constant threats from external enemies, including the Seljuk Turks, the Arabs, and later the Ottoman Turks, who gradually encroached on Byzantine territory. The constant warfare took a toll on the empire's economy and society, leading to increased taxation and hardship for the peasantry. The influence of the Moors in medieval Spain. The Moors, a Muslim population of Berber and Arab descent, played an instrumental role in shaping the culture, society, and politics of medieval Spain. From the early 8th century, when the Moors first crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and swiftly conquered much of the Iberian Peninsula, their influence was felt across the region. The period of Moorish rule, known as Al-Andalus, brought with it a unique blend of Islamic, Christian, and Jewish cultures, resulting in a rich and diverse society that left a lasting legacy on Spain. At the height of their power, the Moors controlled vast parts of Spain, including regions such as Andalusia, Valencia, and Granada. The capital of Moorish Spain, Córdoba, became one of the most prosperous and advanced cities in Europe. Under Moorish rule, Córdoba was a center of learning, culture, and trade, rivaling the great cities of the medieval world. The city boasted libraries, universities, and mosques, including the famous Great Mosque of Córdoba, a masterpiece of Islamic architecture. Córdoba's streets were paved, its homes had running water, and its markets were filled with goods from across the Mediterranean and beyond. The Moors were known for their contributions to science, mathematics, medicine, and philosophy. Scholars in Al-Andalus preserved and translated classical texts from Greek and Roman civilizations, which had been lost to much of Christian Europe during the early medieval period. These texts included the works of Aristotle, Plato, and Hippocrates, and they were studied alongside Islamic scholarship in fields such as astronomy, algebra, and medicine. The famous philosopher and polymath Averroes, Ibn Rushd, who lived in Al-Andalus, played a key role in transmitting Greek philosophy to medieval Europe. Moorish influence extended beyond intellectual achievements. Agriculture in medieval Spain was transformed by Moorish innovations. The Moors introduced advanced irrigation systems, including aqueducts and canals, which allowed for the cultivation of crops such as rice, citrus fruits, sugarcane, and cotton. These innovations boosted agricultural productivity and helped make Spain one of the most fertile regions in Europe. The architecture of the time also reflected this blend of cultures, with Moorish designs featuring intricate tilework, horseshoe arches, and lush gardens, which can still be seen in landmarks like the Alhambra in Granada and the Alcazar of Seville. The coexistence of Muslims, Christians, and Jews in Al-Andalus is often referred to as a period of convivencia, or coexistence. While there were certainly periods of conflict, particularly as Christian kingdoms in the north began to push back against Moorish rule, there were also long stretches of relative peace in which the three religious groups lived side by side. Muslim rulers in Al-Andalus were generally tolerant of religious minorities, allowing Christians and Jews to practice their faith in exchange for a tax known as the jizya. Many Jews and Christians held important positions in the Moorish courts, and Jewish scholars in particular flourished under Muslim rule. The Jewish population of Al-Andalus produced some of the medieval period's most important thinkers, such as the philosopher Maimonides. Jewish communities in Moorish Spain were known for their contributions to trade, science, and philosophy, and their interaction with both Islamic and Christian scholars helped facilitate the transmission of knowledge across cultural boundaries. Similarly, Christian communities, while a minority in the Moorish-controlled areas, continued to practice their traditions and often adopted elements of Islamic culture in their dress, language, and architecture. Despite the achievements of Moorish Spain, it was not immune to conflict. The Reconquista, the centuries-long effort by Christian kingdoms to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule, began shortly after the initial Moorish conquest. Over the course of several centuries, Christian forces gradually pushed the Moors southward, reclaiming territory piece by piece. By the late 13th century, only the Kingdom of Granada remained under Muslim control, and even this final bastion of Moorish rule would eventually fall to Ferdinand and Isabella in 1492. The fall of Granada marked the end of Moorish rule in Spain, but the legacy of the Moors continued to influence Spanish culture for centuries. The architectural wonders of the Alhambra, the Mezquita in Córdoba, and other Moorish landmarks became symbols of Spain's diverse heritage. Spanish cuisine, language, and music also bear the marks of Moorish influence, with words of Arabic origin still present in the Spanish language and traditional Spanish music echoing the rhythms of Andalusian Arab melodies. In addition to their cultural contributions, the Moors left a lasting impact on Spanish social structures. The Mujars, Muslims who remained in Spain after the Reconquista, were allowed to continue practicing their religion and customs in exchange for loyalty to the Christian rulers. However, over time, as Spain became more unified under Christian rule, religious tolerance declined. By the late 15th century, the Catholic monarchs instituted policies that forced Muslims and Jews to either convert to Christianity or face expulsion. This period of religious persecution, culminating in the Spanish Inquisition, brought an end to the pluralistic society that had flourished under Moorish rule. In conclusion, the Moors played a pivotal role in shaping medieval Spain, leaving a legacy that extended far beyond their military conquests. Their contributions to science, architecture, agriculture, and culture enriched the Iberian Peninsula and laid the groundwork for many of the innovations that would later spread throughout Europe. The period of Moorish rule in Spain remains a defining chapter in the country's history, one that continues to influence Spanish culture, identity, and society to this day. Medieval Portugal, exploration and social hierarchy. In medieval Portugal, the society was shaped by both the feudal system and the country's early forays into exploration, which would later position Portugal as a leading maritime power in the Age of Discovery. During the Middle Ages, Portugal was still solidifying its borders and consolidating power, particularly after gaining independence from the Kingdom of Leon in the 12th century. As a newly independent kingdom, Portugal's social structure mirrored that of much of medieval Europe, with a clear hierarchy that placed the nobility and clergy at the top, while the peasants and serfs formed the base of society. Feudalism in Portugal was deeply rooted in the agricultural economy. Much of the land was controlled by the nobles, who held titles such as dukes, counts, and barons, granted to them by the king in return for their loyalty and military service. These nobles ruled over vast estates and were responsible for protecting the peasants who worked their lands. The manor system was the dominant economic model, with peasants providing agricultural labor in exchange for protection and the right to farm small plots of land. The serfs were bound to the land, working in the fields to produce crops such as wheat, barley, and olives, which were the staples of the Portuguese economy. The clergy also held considerable power in medieval Portugal. The Catholic Church owned large tracts of land and wielded significant influence over both the nobility and the common people. Monasteries and convents were important centers of education, culture, and spirituality, and the bishoprics in cities like Lisbon and Porto were key to the kingdom's political life. The church played a dual role in both the spiritual and temporal governance of the kingdom, with high-ranking church officials often serving as advisors to the king or as leaders of local communities. The Knights Templar also played a notable role in Portugal, particularly in defending the country's borders during the Reconquista, the Christian reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule. For the peasantry, life was centered around the village and the agricultural calendar. Peasants worked long hours in the fields, tending to crops and livestock. Their homes were simple, usually made of wood or stone, with thatched roofs. Despite the hardships, village life fostered a strong sense of community, with social activities revolving around the local church and religious festivals. The church was a key institution in the lives of peasants, providing both spiritual guidance and practical support through charity and assistance in times of hardship. In the cities, merchants and artisans began to play an increasingly important role as Portugal's economy shifted from purely agrarian to more trade-oriented. Cities like Lisbon and Porto became hubs of commerce, connecting Portugal to trade networks that span the Mediterranean, North Africa, and even as far as the Baltic. The growth of trade also gave rise to guilds, associations of craftsmen and traders who regulated the quality of goods, set prices, and protected the interests of their members. These guilds had significant social and political influence in urban centers, and their members often held positions of power within the city councils. Portugal's strategic location on the Atlantic coast also encouraged early exploration. During the late medieval period, Portuguese navigators began to venture further along the coast of North Africa, laying the groundwork for the later voyages of explorers such as Prince Henry the Navigator in the 15th century. This early interest in exploration reflected the ambitions of the Portuguese nobility and monarchs to expand their influence beyond the Iberian Peninsula. The Azores and Madeira Islands were discovered during this time, marking the beginning of Portugal's expansion into the Atlantic, which would later lead to its rise as a global maritime empire. By the 14th century, Portugal's social hierarchy was well established, with the king at the top, followed by the nobles, clergy, and the emerging merchant class. Below them were the peasants, who made up the majority of the population. The king's authority was often mediated by powerful noble families, who controlled large regions of the country and held significant military power. Despite this, the Portuguese monarchy was relatively centralized compared to other European kingdoms, thanks in part to the king's alliances with the church and the military orders, which helped maintain internal stability. Religion and chivalric values also played a critical role in shaping Portuguese society during the medieval period. The Reconquista, the centuries-long campaign to reclaim land from the Moors, was not only a military endeavor but also a religious crusade. Portuguese knights saw themselves as defenders of Christendom, and their participation in the Reconquista earned them both land and prestige. The Order of Avis, a military order founded during the Reconquista, became an important political force in Portugal, blending the values of knighthood with religious zeal. In summary, medieval Portugal was a kingdom shaped by its feudal structures, religious institutions, and early ambitions for exploration. The nobles and clergy dominated the social hierarchy, while the peasants worked the land and the emerging merchant class began to transform the economy. As Portugal prepared to launch into the Age of Discovery, the social fabric of the kingdom was deeply rooted in both tradition and the desire for expansion, setting the stage for its future as a leading maritime power. Viking society, life in Scandinavia. The Vikings were one of the most feared and revered cultures of medieval Europe, known for their seafaring skills, raids, and exploration. But beyond the stories of warriors and raids, Viking society in Scandinavia was complex, with a structured social hierarchy, strong community bonds, and a deep connection to the land and the sea. Life in Viking society was shaped by the rugged environment of Scandinavia, which included modern-day Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. At the top of Viking society were the Jarls, the noble class who owned large estates, commanded military forces, and held political power. Jarls were often the leaders of Viking expeditions, whether for trade, exploration, or raids, and they had significant influence over the local communities. The Jarls were responsible for administering justice, protecting the land, and ensuring the prosperity of their people. Below the Jarls were the Carls, the free farmers, merchants, and craftsmen who made up the majority of Viking society. Agriculture was the backbone of life for many Carls, with farming and animal husbandry providing food and resources for the community. The harsh climate of Scandinavia made farming difficult, but the Vikings were skilled at growing hardy crops like barley, rye, and oats, as well as raising livestock such as cattle, sheep, and pigs. The longhouse, a large wooden building where extended families lived together, was the typical dwelling for both Jarls and Carls. Trade was another important aspect of Viking life. The Vikings were not only raiders but also traders, and they established extensive trade networks that connected Scandinavia to Byzantium, the Islamic world, and even North America. Viking merchants traveled far and wide, exchanging goods like furs, amber, ivory, and iron for luxury items such as silk, spices, and silver. The Viking settlements in Dublin, York, and Kiev became important centers of trade and cultural exchange, where goods from across Europe and Asia flowed through Viking hands. The thralls were the lowest class in Viking society, consisting of slaves who were either captured during raids or born into slavery. Thralls worked the land, served in households, and performed other labor-intensive tasks. While thralls had little personal freedom, they were considered valuable members of Viking society, and their treatment varied depending on the wealth and status of their owners. Some thralls were able to gain their freedom over time, either through service or by purchasing their release. Viking society placed a strong emphasis on community and law. The Thing, a local assembly where free men could gather to discuss issues, resolve disputes, and make decisions, was central to Viking governance. At these assemblies, laws were passed, and justice was administered, often through fines or banishment. While the Jarls held authority, the Thing gave ordinary Carls a voice in matters of law and order, making Viking society relatively egalitarian compared to other medieval cultures. Religion also played an important role in Viking society. The Vikings worshipped a pantheon of gods, the most famous being Odin, the god of war and wisdom, and Thor, the god of thunder. Norse mythology was rich with stories of gods, giants, and mythical creatures, and these tales were passed down orally from generation to generation. Rituals and sacrifices were an essential part of Viking religious life, often conducted in sacred groves or at altars dedicated to the gods. The concept of Valhalla, a grand hall where warriors slain in battle were believed to go after death, was central to the Viking warrior ethos. Viking society was also notable for the relative freedom and respect given to women compared to other medieval cultures. While Viking society was still patriarchal, women had significant rights, particularly in matters of property and inheritance. Viking women could own land, run businesses, and even divorce their husbands if the marriage was not satisfactory. Some women, known as shield maidens, were even believed to have taken part in battles, though this is a subject of historical debate. Viking women were responsible for managing households, raising children, and producing textiles, which were vital to the economy. Reading was another key aspect of Viking life, though it was not as central to the culture as often portrayed. Vikings would set out in their iconic longships, sleek and fast vessels designed for both sea voyages and river navigation. These raids were not just about plunder but also about asserting power and gaining resources. Viking raids targeted monasteries, towns, and coastal settlements across Europe, particularly in England, France, and Ireland. However, many Vikings also settled in the lands they raided, establishing permanent communities in places like Normandy and the British Isles. As the Viking Age progressed, the influence of Christianity began to grow in Scandinavia. By the 11th century, many Vikings had converted to Christianity, largely due to the influence of European missionaries and the political alliances formed with Christian rulers. The conversion process was gradual, and for a time, Viking society was a blend of pagan and Christian practices. Over time, however, Christianity became the dominant religion, and the traditional Norse gods and rituals faded into history. In conclusion, Viking society was complex and multifaceted, with a strong emphasis on community, trade, and exploration. While they are often remembered for their raids and warrior culture, the Vikings were also skilled farmers, traders, and craftsmen who left a lasting legacy on Europe and beyond. The social structure of jarls, carls, and thralls, along with the Viking thing and their unique religious beliefs, created a society that was both innovative and deeply rooted in tradition. Medieval Ireland and Scotland, monastic life and clans. In medieval Ireland and Scotland, society was shaped by a unique blend of clan-based organization and the influence of Christian monasticism. Both regions maintained strong cultural traditions that distinguished them from the more feudal societies of continental Europe, and their remote geography allowed for the development of distinctive social structures. In both Ireland and Scotland, life was centered around two primary institutions, the clan system and the monasteries, each playing an essential role in shaping daily life, politics, and culture. In Ireland, the most important social unit was the clan or tuath, which was essentially a large family group that included both noble families and their dependents. The clan chiefs were the heads of these extended families, and they held authority over the lands and people under their protection. Unlike the feudal system that dominated most of Europe, the Irish clan system was less centralized. Power was distributed among the various clans, each of which had its own laws, customs, and territory. These clans were often in competition with one another, and conflicts between rival clans were common, but alliances were also forged through marriages and political agreements. The social structure in medieval Ireland was hierarchical, with the nobles or flaith at the top, followed by free farmers, and then the servants and laborers who worked the land. Free farmers, known as ceilidh, played a crucial role in the agricultural economy, managing their own plots of land but still owing allegiance to the clan chiefs. These farmers were relatively independent compared to their counterparts in feudal societies, where peasants had little control over their land or their lives. However, the lowest classes, including servants and bondsmen, had far fewer rights and lived under the direct control of the noble families. Religion was a key element in the structure of Irish society, with the Christian monasteries serving as centers of learning, culture, and spirituality. Monasticism played a particularly significant role in Ireland during the early medieval period, when the country became a renowned center of Christian scholarship. Irish monks, such as St. Columba and St. Patrick, were famous for their missionary work, spreading Christianity across both Ireland and Scotland. Monasteries such as Clonmacnoise, Kells, and Glendalough were not only religious centers but also places where art, literature, and religious manuscripts were produced and preserved. The famous Book of Kells, a richly illustrated manuscript, is one of the greatest achievements of Irish monastic culture. In Scotland, the social and political organization was similarly centered around the clan system. Scottish clans were powerful family groups led by a chieftain who had authority over the land and people of the clan's territory. The clan structure was based on kinship ties, and loyalty to the clan was paramount. Honor, revenge, and hospitality were key elements of Scottish clan culture, and disputes between clans could result in lengthy feuds, often resolved through warfare or alliances. Like in Ireland, free farmers in Scotland played a significant role in society, working the land and raising livestock, especially cattle and sheep. Scottish farming was heavily influenced by the rugged terrain and climate, which shaped both the crops that could be grown and the animals that could be raised. Many farmers lived in longhouses, similar to those in Viking society, where extended families and livestock shared the same living space. The harsh landscape of the Scottish Highlands made agriculture challenging, but the clan system provided a structure that helped communities survive by pooling resources and labor. Religion also had a significant impact on Scottish society. The Celtic Church was established early in Scotland's history, influenced by Irish missionaries such as St. Columba, who founded the famous monastery on the island of Iona in the 6th century. This monastery became a center for Christian learning, much like the Irish monasteries, and played a key role in the spread of Christianity across Scotland and northern Britain. Scottish monasteries, like their Irish counterparts, were centers of culture and learning, producing illuminated manuscripts, religious texts, and beautiful metalwork. Monasteries in both Ireland and Scotland were not only religious institutions but also places of education and economic activity. The monks engaged in agriculture, maintaining large estates and producing surplus food, which was used to support the monastery and provide charity to the local population. These monasteries also provided education to the sons of the nobility, teaching them to read, write, and understand Christian doctrine. The close relationship between the Celtic Church and the clans meant that the Church had significant influence over the political and social life of both regions. However, the relative peace and stability of monastic life in Ireland and Scotland were often interrupted by the threat of Viking raids. From the late 8th century onward, Viking longships appeared along the coasts of both Ireland and Scotland, raiding monasteries and settlements for gold, slaves, and other valuables. Monasteries, with their wealth and treasures, were frequent targets, and many were plundered or destroyed. Despite these disruptions, the monasteries remained resilient, and many rebuilt or relocated further inland to avoid future attacks. And that brings us to the end of today's journey through the fascinating world of medieval Europe. From the clans of Ireland and Scotland to the monastic life and the dynamic societies across the continent, we've explored how these unique cultures shape the world we live in today. I hope you enjoyed this exploration as much as I enjoyed whispering it to you. If you did, don't forget to give a thumbs up and subscribe for more relaxing dives into history. Thank you for joining me, and as always, I look forward to sharing more whispered tales with you soon. Good night, and take care. Artisans and guilds in the Low Countries. In the medieval period, the Low Countries, modern-day Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, became one of Europe's most prosperous regions, largely due to the success of its artisans and guilds. This region, characterized by its thriving towns and cities such as Bruges, Ghent, and Antwerp, was a center of commerce, craftsmanship, and trade. The artisans and guilds that emerged in these cities played a central role in the development of the region's economy and its social structures. The guild system in the Low Countries was highly organized and influential. Guilds were associations of craftsmen or merchants who controlled the production of goods, regulated prices, and ensured the quality of their members' work. Each trade, whether it was weaving, metalworking, or shoemaking, had its own guild. The guilds held significant power within the cities, not only in economic matters but also in social and political life. Membership in a guild was a mark of prestige and provided artisans with protection, support, and the opportunity for social mobility. At the heart of guild life was the master craftsman. To become a master, an artisan had to complete a rigorous process of training, which began as an apprentice. Young boys, usually between the ages of 12 and 14, would enter into apprenticeships with established masters, learning the skills of the trade over several years. Once the apprenticeship was complete, the artisan would become a journeyman, traveling to different towns to gain experience and perfect his craft. Only after creating a masterpiece, a work that demonstrated exceptional skill, could a journeyman be accepted into the guild as a master craftsman. Guilds were responsible for maintaining high standards of craftsmanship and ensuring that their members adhered to strict rules regarding the quality of their work. They regulated everything from the types of materials that could be used to the prices that could be charged for finished products. This ensured that goods produced in the Low Countries were of consistent quality, which in turn helped the region's cities maintain their reputations as centers of excellence in craftsmanship and trade. The weaving and textile industries were particularly important in the Low Countries, with cities like Ghent and Bruges becoming famous for their fine cloth. The production of woolen textiles was a major source of wealth, and guilds of weavers, fullers, and dyers controlled every aspect of the production process. The success of the textile industry attracted merchants from across Europe, turning the cities of the Low Countries into major hubs of international trade. The annual fairs held in these cities drew merchants from as far away as England, Italy, and the Baltic, further enhancing the region's economic power. In addition to regulating trade and production, guilds also had a significant social function. Guilds provided support to their members in times of hardship, such as illness or financial difficulty, and they played a key role in the social life of the cities. Guilds organized festivals, feasts, and religious processions, contributing to the vibrant urban culture of the Low Countries. The guild hall, where members met to discuss business and social matters, was often one of the most impressive buildings in the city, reflecting the wealth and power of the guilds. Guilds were also involved in the political life of the cities. In many towns, the leaders of the most powerful guilds held positions of authority on the city council, giving them significant influence over local governance. This close relationship between guilds and the city government helped to ensure that the interests of the artisans were protected and that the cities remained economically stable. In some cases, guilds even had their own militias, which could be called upon to defend the city in times of war or conflict. Despite their power and influence, the guilds in the Low Countries were not without controversy. As the guild system became more established, it also became more exclusive. Access to guild membership was often restricted, with many guilds only allowing the sons of existing members to join. This made it difficult for outsiders or those from lower social classes to enter the crafts, leading to tension between the guilds and the growing population of unskilled laborers in the cities. Over time, the guild's control over trade and production began to be challenged by the rise of more market-driven economies, especially as the power of the merchant class grew. The artisans and guilds of the Low Countries also played a crucial role in the development of art and culture. The region was known for its fine art, particularly in painting, sculpture, and metalwork. Many of the great artists of the medieval and early Renaissance periods, such as Jan van Eyck and Roger van der Weyden, were associated with the guilds. These artists, though independent in their work, often collaborated with guilds, creating religious and civic artworks that adorned churches, guild halls, and public spaces. The artistic traditions of the Low Countries were renowned across Europe, and their influence can still be seen in the region's rich cultural heritage today. In conclusion, the artisans and guilds of the Low Countries were central to the region's economic and social development during the medieval period. Through their control of trade, production, and political power, the guilds helped to create some of the wealthiest and most dynamic cities in Europe. The legacy of these guilds, and the high standards of craftsmanship they upheld, continues to be celebrated in the art, architecture, and cultural traditions of the region.